joining us here at Progressive Insider. I'm Don Ford. Today, I'm here with an interview from someone who ran for governor in Vermont this last time in 2018 and is running again for lieutenant governor in 2020. Not only did she come out of nowhere to have an excellent turnout in the governor bid, she's also really kept her name in Vermont politics because her opioid plan has become the standard bearer, not only in just Vermont, but nationally in so many groups. Brenda Siegel is here with me today. Brenda, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So you're running for lieutenant governor.
I am.
A seat, let's point out, that a Democrat currently holds, and that Democrat is leaving office to run for governor.
Right. Well, he's a progressive / Democrat because we can run Fusion in Vermont, and he is running for governor.
Wait, Fusion in Vermont? What does that mean?
That means that, so there's three parties in Vermont, actually, three active parties. There's the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and the Progressive Party. And our current lieutenant governor ran on the Democratic ticket to win the Democratic nomination, and he is also a progressive, and he earned that nomination as well, and he runs progressive / Democrat.
That sounds kind of familiar. I feel like there's somebody else in Vermont that does that same thing.
Well, you're thinking of Bernie, but Bernie runs on the Democratic ticket, and then he switches to independent. So right. He actually doesn't run progressive. He just runs independent.
Okay. Well, my understanding is you have a pretty good relationship with both sides of the party here, both of these parties. And then the Republican Party, what are they doing in Vermont? Because they hold the governorship, don't they?
So there is a Republican governor right now. He's considered a moderate. I would say that his veto pen is actually quite mean, even though people consider him nice. And but I do think that his quote unquote niceness is what has got him elected year after year. And he has signed a couple of good policies that have allowed that as well. But in terms of progress in Vermont, he really is a big barrier to any sort of real progress.
So you ran for governor last time, and you kind of jumped in late in the game. You were in the last 3 months, was it?
I was. I entered in early to mid-May, and the primary was on August 14th.
And what was the final turnout of that election?
So I had no name recognition going in. I had no time, as we just discussed, and I really am a low-income single mom, so I had no access to money, and I was able to get 21% of the vote in a four-way race for governor from that, and up my name recognition by quite a lot.
Now, do you remember what the actual win number, what the person who won the primary actually won with?
I am not sure exactly.
Okay. We'll look that up. It's fine. But that's in a four-way race. You know, people think about win totals as this like majority or 50, simple majority, 50 plus one, but it's not actually like that. You can actually win these races with like 35%. And so you're much closer than most people would recognize initially. And so this time around, your current lieutenant governor has decided to run for governor. You're deciding to run for lieutenant governor.
Right.
Let's go back though. Let's go back a little bit. 3 months until the election, you decided to take on one of the hardest things someone can do and run for governor, having never held elected office. Why? What inspired you to make a move like that?
Well, I actually would have announced much earlier, but I decided my final decision. I went over it for about a year and a half, whether or not I should run. I did a lot of research. I did training programs. I spoke to lots of different organizations. I really wanted to make sure both that I had a strong vision for the state, and also that it was something that it was really the best way to move forward any kind of progress. But
so then you didn't come out of nowhere. You did the groundwork beforehand to prepare yourself, and that's important to distinguish because doing that groundwork makes you be able to make this huge push in just a short amount of time.
Right, and also I think it's really important to understand that people who are coming from a more marginalized community, in my case as a low-income single mom, we know that we have to have all of our ducks in a row if we're going to go forward and convince the public that we're prepared to handle a job.
Because that's what it is, right? This is a job application. So please go ahead.
I mean, in my mind, it's all of these roles are really about how do we bring all of the people into the democratic process, right? Well, I don't think we do a great job of that. I think that's what we're seeing with progressive candidates across the ballot, is that it is time that we're bringing the people into the process.
Right, and the process can be awfully confusing. But,
Right.
I think that we're going to go back just a little bit further. So everyone has a story.
Mm-hmm.
I know yours. I know it already. But I need you to tell it to the public. What was your impetus that got you really, I think I used that word right. I'm trying to sound smarter maybe than I am. But what was it that really was the thing you had to make a change? You had to do something.
Well, I actually didn't run for this reason. I ran really because it's time for us to build a bottom-up economy, and it's time for us to make sure that we're lifting as we rise. And instead of thinking that trickle-down economics works, because we know that it doesn't, and in fact, poverty trickles up. And that's what we've been seeing for the last many years. And so that was what originally inspired me. How are we going to make change where people really do engage and get involved? I've been able to do that regardless of my situation throughout my adult life. How can I bring that to other people? However, on March 7th, I decided for sure that I would run for governor. I made that final decision of 2018. And then on March 8th of 2018, so the next day, my nephew died of a heroin overdose.
Oh my God.
And he was the son of my brother who had died over 20 years ago, also of a heroin overdose.
Mm.
And I had been a huge part of his upbringing. And I believe that the first words that I wrote on social media to try to tell people were a picture of him and I'm broken. And I really didn't think I would be able to go forward. I really wasn't sure because I really was broken. And
I can see why this opioid issue isn't just a issue. It's not just an idea on a wall to you. This is something that has directly affected you and your family personally. So this isn't an issue that people think you might be pandering for or that you're not very serious about. This is something that is critical to you because you have witnessed and experienced the loss of life that other people all over the country are feeling, and we have to do something about it.
Right. All I want is for people for their lives to be saved. I have not only experienced the loss of two people, but I've experienced a 20-year span in between in which there was not the services available that either my brother for his mental illness or my nephew for his mental illness and his opioid use disorder. They just weren't available. And not only that, how the system failed over and over and over again. Each time that he was doing all right, the system would fail and derail him. And so we knew as a family what the right things were to do, what we needed, what other people in other situations, we had heard their stories, we knew what they needed, and yet we would stand in those meetings and it would fall on deaf ears. And so it has to change. If we really are serious about ending the 70,000 plus people who die from substance use disorder overdoses in this country every year, then we actually have to make a substantial change in not only the way we operate, but the way we think about this disease.
Absolutely. And so I want to bridge something real fast before we get into solutions, because that's obviously where this conversation is headed, because you are the person to talk to about solutions on this. We talk about a lot of things at Progressive Insider about a lot of different issues affecting people. And I think one of them that comes a lot is the school to prison pipeline. And that overflows into a lot of other things. So when you talk about the system failing people,
Mm-hmm.
I think, and especially when you're dealing with, I'm not going to use the right language because I know we're going to talk about what the right language to use is. When you're talking about drug abuse or addiction or the opioid crisis in general, it's hard not to see the system failing intentionally. So it's not just a matter of it's dropping the ball on people. Like you're saying, 20 years ago, we knew what the problem was, and they're still not doing anything about it. And at a certain point, it feels like they're intentionally failing their own people.
Well, I would say that some of the steps that we've taken, at least in Vermont, have been with the right intention in mind,
Hmm.
but the reality is that we're not hearing that the drug war doesn't work. So creating more crimes or criminalizing, like the whole idea of accountability, is not necessarily a real thing, because the reality is that people with resources still die from this disease. However, they aren't criminalized in the same way, right? And people without resources, and especially people of color, and in Vermont we have a huge disparity, are treated completely differently and have major barriers. And I think that, but either way, we're looking at the disease all wrong. We aren't prioritizing things like harm reduction and criminal justice reform and dual diagnosis support. We aren't prioritizing that and understanding that that's what really works. And so I think that it's a people-made problem, and people-made problems can be people-fixed.
The wise words. I think that also when we talk about this, we've argued about this in the past, and that's not where I promise I'm going with right now, but I think that I think it's important to distinguish, like, there's going to be some listener or viewer who has a problem with the idea of it being called a disease. And I really want people to think about something as a concept, that when we use language as a thing, it's not necessarily about anything more than how we need people to adjust their thinking to an idea. Because really, there's only two ways of thinking about this problem right now. Either you criminalize the behavior, or you look at it as a disease that requires some sort of medical care. Because one requires police and one requires doctors. And we need to get these people doctors. And that's really the important distinction here. Is that about right?
Well, I don't even know. Interestingly, with this disease, we'll talk about harm reduction in a little bit, but that is actually something that works and doesn't necessarily involve, although we do need more treatment, that can work to save people's lives until they're ready for that, or until they can access it.
Okay, harm reduction is a concept. It's like
right.
Way proactive. You're not waiting until there's a problem. You're doing something way before.
Right, but what I want to say, I think, is that there are people out there who understand it to be a disease and still think accountability will work. And I think what I always say to people is, regardless, if you believe that the people with the opioid use disorder or substance use disorder who are victims of the overdose crisis are making bad choices, and even if you believe that they somehow deserve the outcome, and there are people that believe that they deserve to die, that they deserve the outcome, even if that's true, they also would like to be in a situation where our houses aren't being broken into, where we aren't buying needles on the street, where our cars aren't being broken into, which is a huge problem in my community right now. And in order to actually solve that problem, we still have to follow best practices. And so regardless if people agree with me or not, we know that there is another system that works. And in order to solve the problems that they want solved, that we all want solved, then we have to do that. We have to move forward with best practices.
It's almost like the education system in America. A lot of people think we educate for the individual, and that's actually not true. We actually educate for the group, because the world is a better place when there are more smart people in it. The phrase is actually less dumb people in it, but I'm not a big fan of that. And I think this is true when we're talking about this as a concept, that we're not talking about trying to help this individual. We're trying to improve society as a whole. And we don't improve them by ignoring the problem. We improve it by creating methods of harm reduction so that we can improve the quality of our entire society. Not just these, few people that are hurt, or the few things that overlap, the things we don't see, like the lurkers online. We don't see all the damage that's done, and it's causing long-term damage in a lot of very complicated ways. So let's talk about this harm reduction concept and solutions.
So harm reduction, I'm looking down because I'm looking at my plan, but harm reduction in other countries, they've established strong decriminalization and harm reduction practices. And deaths have stopped or decreased a lot, and crime has stopped or decreased a lot.
So what you're talking about are like in the Netherlands and other places, they've set up, I don't know if I get a little mixed up about the countries there sometimes, but I know that they've set up like booths for people to do drugs in safely, where there's Narcan available and there's a treatment for the thing, so that if something goes wrong, they can get what they need. They can have clean needles, they can do all these things. You try to give them what they need, and they actually see drug use actually fall through this process.
Well, it's been done differently in different places. So we're not ready in this country to decriminalize drugs, period, right? Because we just aren't. We're not there. However, in Portugal, they did decriminalize drugs and they increased their human services. And as a result, they have stopped death and crime and reduced the amount of people that were suffering from the disease. And people were dying at pretty alarming rates in Portugal. And they included having mobile harm reduction units and all kinds of things like that. And here, we've seen some movement, at least in Vermont, but it really needs to grow beyond Vermont at this point. But we've seen some movement on clean needle exchanges. So it's not always the safe injection site, which actually people are asking us to call overdose prevention sites, but the clean needle exchanges, which
they
are
want
really
overdose projection sites instead of clean, because they don't want to sound like they're pro doing drugs. They want to be pro saving
overdose
lives.
prevention site. I think what is really important to understand about it, let's talk about that when we get to it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So clean needle exchanges are really basic, right? If you are not using clean needles, you might be spreading hepatitis C or HIV. We know that when you use clean needles instead, we reduce those risks, and those risks go beyond the population of people with overdose, with opioid use disorder. They go to people that they're sleeping with, to somewhat where there might be some kind of blood exchange of some other way. And so clean needle exchanges are extremely important for a variety of reasons, but they also are an opportunity at the point at which the needle exchange happens to connect with somebody with opioid use disorder and talk to them about what other options there may be, not push them on them, but actually develop a relationship. And that is why some harm reduction strategies work. But also...
during the HIV, when it was really going hard, everyone was really afraid that everyone thought that it was a gay problem or this problem or a thing problem. But when you add injection drugs into the scenario, it really becomes an everyone problem.
Right, and it was an everyone problem even then anyways.
Of course. I don't want to diminish. I just say that's what they mislabeled in society. They thought the world was flat.
And then there's Narcan. Now in Vermont, in some parts of Vermont, you can get unlimited Narcan. So you can go pick up 5 Narcans, and it can take up to 3 or 4 for an active overdose that has fentanyl in it. And most heroin, I'm going to go ahead and say all heroin right now has fentanyl in it. And that's why we're seeing people die at these alarming rates, because it's really hard to survive this disease now with the introduction of fentanyl into the drug. So
I don't have anything to say about that. The fentanyl stuff is really scary. I had a little bit of a scare I'll get into another time that I thought was ultimately ended up being fentanyl related, where I almost had to be hospitalized because I had skin to skin contact with somebody who was obviously on drugs, and I almost immediately had a reaction to it, and it was really terrifying. And so the idea of what's going on here is really scary.
I promise not to fight with you, but they have completely debunked the myth that can happen.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, they have completely debunked it.
I still don't know what happened.
Actually, you promised not to fight with me.
Yeah, no, I don't really know what happened. It was in Florida, and we had always attributed it at the time because it was sort of like a random thing that had happened very quickly. It wasn't skin to skin. I touched my mouth.
But even then, you have to have a very significant amount go
injected. You'd have to have the drug in your thing.
You'd have to have a cut on your arm, and then it'd have to rub a bunch of it in, and then you might feel something.
And I have questions. I'm curious about then when they have these episodes at the jails every so often where their system is just a lot more of it than people realize.
People are actually using it, and that's how it's being. And also corrections officers are sometimes using it, because opioid use disorder is not discriminatory to people who are in prison or in poverty.
Right, because if you can hide it, no one knows.
Right, exactly.
Okay, and this is where the needle exchange is so important, because it's normal people that are also using these drugs who are hiding the drugs, and then they end up infecting their non-drug using family members who don't even know. Right.
So there's the unlimited Narcan. Now, Narcan stops an active overdose. So a lot of people don't know that. Really, police officers and people with EMTs, everyone you and I should really all be carrying Narcan at all times. At this point in our country where there is so much overdose, we really should have Narcan on us. But in some states, it's not even legal to have it on us. So when I traveled, for example, recently to DC for an overdose crisis convening with People's Action and Rights and Democracy in Vermont and New Hampshire, I had to check whether or not I was allowed to have Narcan with me in Connecticut, whether or not I was allowed to have Narcan with me in DC, and whether or not I would be allowed to bring it on the plane. I ultimately threw it out because I couldn't get a good answer. However, it's absurd, right? Because there are people in our airplanes and in our airports and everywhere using heroin laced with fentanyl, and we should have Narcan on us. And so that has to become a really mainstream. It is pretty mainstream in Vermont, although in certain parts of the state you're only allowed to have one or two, and you should be allowed to have unlimited everywhere.
People really underestimate how many people are really dying from this on a daily basis. It's really, especially in rural parts of the country where the numbers and statistics aren't reported as much as they might be. I mean, they are reported, but nobody's really paying attention. And
Right.
It's sort of, it's this surge of that we really have to do something about. I think we're getting into like, I think, when we talk about war, right, and war will wipe out a whole generation. I feel like we're having that happen on a slightly smaller scale, with a whole generation of people are getting wiped out by opioid abuse. Not abuse. What's the phrase I'm supposed to use?
Opioid use disorder. And it's actually, we're really saying the overdose crisis now, because it's now not just opioids. There's also meth coming back into the picture in a major way. There is cocaine, some being laced with fentanyl. And so we do have to talk about it in a much more broad way. Also, a lot of people die from alcohol now and always have, and we don't want to forget that or let it go to the wayside. And so the overdose crisis is really how we're talking about it, rather than, we're talking a lot about opioid use disorder today, but the overdose crisis is really what we're talking about as a whole.
It seems like the language here is really, really important, because this ultimately becomes another form of not only preventative action, but proactive reaction, because you want, again, I think in the Bernie movement, I spent so long talking about inclusive to people. I've noticed the language surrounding this is very, very inclusive. It's really trying to make people feel like they don't necessarily have a problem, and they believe that will allow people to take action more quickly, to seek help.
Right. Well, there's a lot of stigma. So the stigma is what is preventing us from good drug policy. And so and also we've used words like calling people addicts, addiction. We've also used some much more stigmatizing language, and all those words in our minds already have a trigger for what they mean about a human being, right? And opioid use disorder or substance use disorder is what is happening to the person. It isn't related to who they are, right? So my nephew was not an addict. That's not who he was. He was a person with opioid use disorder and bipolar. And we want to talk about it differently.
Who couldn't get the treatment that he needed.
Who was derailed over and over again. And, he would be in a treatment facility. One time he was in Vermont, he was in a outpatient program where he was getting Lamictal for his bipolar, as well as the Suboxone for his opioid use disorder. And the place called Maple Leaf closed without warning, leaving him without a doctor to prescribe either of those medications. So without his bipolar medication or his medication for opioid use disorder. And then he did not have the support he needed at all to stay in recovery, and eventually had a recurrence, which used to be known as a relapse.
So this is happening to thousands of people silently, number one. And number two, how much would a Medicare for All system help in this environment, do you think?
A Medicare for All system would help a lot, and we would still need to the X waiver. There's a waiver that you have to get in order to prescribe buprenorphine. And there is a bill right now in Congress to the X waiver. And that means that if we X'd it, then any person, any doctor, physician could prescribe buprenorphine, which is the life-saving medication for people with opioid use disorder. And right now they have to do significant training, 8 to 24 hours, depending on what level of, whether they're a nurse practitioner or
but no
a
training to
physician.
prescribe opioids. It's sort of like you're a doctor or you're a
No.
doctor, but you want to get people off drugs. Oh, well, you got to take some classes.
Right, and so that has prevented people, because it's adding the stigma from, because I mean,
Doctors don't
really
want to
what they're
do it.
asking is who's worthy and what do you need to do with buprenorphine for it to work. But actually the research that's been done at St. Johns Hopkins and other places has shown that buprenorphine doesn't know whether you're also in therapy. Buprenorphine doesn't know whether you're doing it exactly correctly. It doesn't know any of those things. It still works, just like blood pressure medicine still works, even if I'm eating steak.
So someone who controls legislation around drugs put a bunch of loopholes off of getting people off their addiction to drugs because they make a lot of money selling these drugs to people.
Right. I mean, I think that it's fair to assume that there is a that the plot is pretty thick on how this disease grows and continues to grow.
Not the fun kind of thick, everyone's getting used to these days. The one with the K that no one likes.
Yeah.
So, well, those are, I mean, so as Lieutenant Governor, this would kind of give you a unique opportunity to not only experiment, but implement, or maybe implement an experiment with all these different solutions to make something that actually works.
So I think my plan is harm reduction first, treatment and recovery on demand, including medically assisted treatment on demand, dual diagnosis support, and criminal justice reform. Each section is detailed, and I think that what the Lieutenant Governor's office allows you to do really is push forward issues, because in Vermont, the Lieutenant Governor presides over the Senate, and other than that, has a big platform with which to do what they choose. So what I think should be happening is we should be building a movement, not just on opioid use disorder, but continuing to build that movement on climate change, healing the overdose crisis, building a bottom-up economy, and strengthening and supporting our education system. I think that if we are doing those 4 things, in order to actually build that movement, in order to push these policies forward, what we have to do is bring people in, and we have to lift up the people's voices. I heard recently and I had written it also recently, ironically, but I was at a Martin Luther King Day event, and my friend Amber Arnold said, when all else fails, pass the mic. And we don't see our elected officials do that enough. And what I'm really excited about is hearing from people who are impacted by all of these things. Because if we don't hear from people in active use and recovery and family members who have lost loved ones, if we don't hear from the most marginalized groups that are really impacted by climate change, and from our youth for whom we are leaving our country to, and our children and their children, if we don't hear from the most the people suffering from the most abject poverty, who might have a really hard time getting to the State House to speak their truth or to tell us their story, then we're really not going to be able to solve the problem. Because when the people that face the problems are at the table, that's when real solutions emerge.
I can't think of a better way to make the people of Vermont feel involved in the process than nominating, electing someone like yourself for Lieutenant Governor. I think you would have been a great governor candidate again, but I think Lieutenant Governor is the right spot for you to do what you want to do. And you got a son going to college soon, I understand. I
do. My son is applying to school. He will graduate this year, and he'll go to college soon. And you know, my on-the-ground work has been really fulfilling in the last 2 years, and I really didn't want to walk away from that. And because it's so important to me that we hear from people. And to run for governor, I would have had to at least briefly walk away from that. And there's great, incredible tools that one can use in the governor's seat. However, we also have this kind of untapped potential right now to really drive home this movement. I mean, people think of Vermont as very progressive. Some of our policies are not really moving in that direction in the way that we would like them to. And I think one way for us to really move that forward is to harness the energy of the progressive movement across the country and really just bring it into Vermont, build from the ground up, and bring that energy to the State House.
Yeah, I really want to make a point to people that, to everyone listening and watching this today, is that, you think of the Northeast as a blue, kingdom or whatever, and it's not.
A lot of Republican governors here.
A lot of Republican governors, and the folks who are voting there are surprisingly conservative. They actually are populist more than conservative. They want to vote for the candidate that will grant them the most change. The Republicans will always say they'll do better than the last Republican, and they'll do better than the filthy Democrats. And the Democrats are just ushering the status quo in a lot of these places. I mean, the progressive candidates never have enough money, really, generally speaking. But Vermont's a little different. You don't need a lot of money to run, though. We need people to donate. We need people to sign up for this endorsement process we're doing right now. It's with DFA, right? Democracy for America.
Yeah, Democracy for America is the one that I just filled out, but there'll be many more along the way.
All right, Brenda, I figure voters probably want to get to know you a little bit. And what can you tell us about what you did before or when you're not running for office?
Well, I am the director of the Southern Vermont Dance Festival, which was developed after Tropical Storm Irene, in which my son and I lost all of our belongings, as an long-term economic driver for my community. It is in its 8th season, although we are actually taking a year off right now. And what we do is we connect the arts and recreation and government and our downtown and make sure that it's vibrant so people want to shop, eat, and spend time in our downtown and in our communities. And it has really given me a really strong economic perspective in what it will take to really move progress in a small rural community in terms of the economy. We don't want to talk about how do we build up the economy? Really, we want to go bottom-up economy so that people have purchasing power. We want to make sure that we are passing strong minimum wage policies, paid family leave policies, building a green economy so that we actually have the ability and the resources to really move forward strong policy. And I think that it has been my work that has really driven that idea.
I'm getting this feeling. Getting this weird feeling. I think that weird feeling is you might not be a one-dimensional candidate. I'm getting this sense, I know your opioid plan is super important, and we're going to get to that, or we've already gotten to it, depending on how it gets edited. Point is that you seem to have, you're not just thinking about how to create change. Like most progressives run for office, and they think about these like big bullet points that are federal level, they're only running state level, or they don't really think about the economics of their district and how they can improve things. And you're expressing some points I don't hear a lot of progressive candidates talk about, and I think that's a little disappointing. But I'm excited to hear you say it.
Well, right. I think that the reality is that all these issues are intersectional. If we are not working on economic policy, if we are not working on social justice and economic justice, then we are not working on drug policy, we are not working on racial justice, we are not working on climate justice. We have to be working on all of them together if we actually want any of them to change. We have to stop believing that they're all siloed. They actually are all together, and it is when we all come together that we see that change. And I started my political work as an intern in Bernie Sanders' office in DC in my 20s. I worked in his congressional office. And at the same time, I was also doing some choreography with Baltimore Children's Theater. And what I learned from him there was so much about what we need to be doing if we're going to bring people in and if we're going to make change. And we've seen him sort of chip away at it and make that happen for us. And we need to now do it together. So I think that that's a big piece of it. In addition, I've worked with Rights and Democracy in Vermont as a member leader on healthcare justice, as well as the Raise the Wage Coalition and paid family leave. I think that those issues have had a lot of stops and starts in Vermont. And so we want to do the work to really move forward those issues. I think that there's we need the people, though, and that is something that the most broken part of our democracy right now is, in my mind, is that we do not show up at the level we need to, and that is because we can't find childcare. We don't have the resources to get to the State House or to DC. There's a lot of factors that go in. So how do we build that movement, keeping in mind that people that are not being involved may either believe that their voice doesn't count, and how do we change that, or may really not be able to get there? I mean, you can, in a state like California, getting to your State House might be impossible.
It's from LA to
People.
Sacramento. Right. It's super challenging, and it really, it comes down to so many things that are happening. People really forget how expensive living in poverty actually is, and that's really what it's coming down to, because everyone is nickel and diming you when you don't have a choice.
Right, and I often talk about how I have safety nets that other people in my situation don't have, and still I've had my power shut off. We've still come home to that. I've had time when I didn't know if I was going to be able to afford heat in my house. I've still struggled with just recently with not having transportation and not knowing how I was going to get transportation.
Yeah, and there's really two ways to look at this, right? You can do the haves or the have-nots. You can look at this from the thing of, oh, is this woman ready to represent us? Or you can look at it from the perspective, which I believe is really the most powerful factor, is that you have a greater understanding of what the normal American, the normal Vermonter is going through, the everyday person that politicians usually just ignore, because, that puts you apart from all the career politicians who have had, because the State House jobs pay relatively well and the other jobs pay relatively well, depending on what they're doing. So they're comfortable to a degree. They don't really understand what other, the regular voter is going through. And also I want to say another thing, you said a lot in there. It's very odd for me to be that quiet. Is that, when you talk about people not being able to come out, she's talking about Vermont, which has historically one of the highest turnouts in the whole country. So if you think that she's saying that Vermonters aren't showing up, well, the rest of the country is showing up at numbers up to as much as a third less than Vermont. So,
and I'm not just talking about not showing up for the polls. I'm talking about when there's public testimony, when asking to testify in committee rooms, when there's rallies, because showing up at the polls is one thing. And I would say that actually Vermont's turnout, considering how many people are registered, it's actually quite low, because not in the 90% of us is registered, because registration is so easy in Vermont. However, but in terms of showing up is not voting. Showing up is voting, that's one thing. Yes, we all need to show up, we need to vote. And then the next day, we all need to show up, we need to say that we want our minimum wage to be a livable wage. We need to show up and say that we want paid family and medical leave that is accessible to people who are in the most abject poverty, not just people that are making a little bit more. We need to show up and say that we demand a green economy, because we know that it is people with the least, and it is people of color, and it is the most marginalized people among us, and Indigenous folks, who are actually impacted by climate change in the most severe way as we speak today. And then actually that changes, and in the future we're all going to be deeply impacted, and our children are really facing a pretty rough situation right now, and we aren't doing enough, and they are begging us, they are screaming, they are interrupting our legislature here in Vermont. They are doing the work, and we have to react to that.
I think what you're talking about, and I'm going to put it into super simplified terms for everyone, is you're talking about being involved with the process. And I think that people don't understand, well, people do understand actually how hard it is to be involved with the process if you're not financially stable or a lobbyist is being paid to be there. And I think that I'm going to use my own example, which is an example I've been using a lot lately, which I'm probably beating a dead horse or some terrible other metaphor I'll find out we're not supposed to use anymore. And so the thing is with the superdelegate reform, when I started showing up to all the steps of the process, just by being there consistently, I suddenly got a voice at the table. And just by showing up, I didn't think that when I set out that I would understand the rules better than the people on the actual rules and bylaws. I didn't think that was going to happen, but it did. And there are thousands of people out there who could be in these situations, helping policy, helping drive issues, who actually understand it better than our elected officials, but they are basically being suppressed financially by not being able to be a part of the process. And these are the people we need there more than anyone. We do. We need them there. It's why I've decided to run for DNC right now. I'm going through a whole thing trying to find an e-board person to sign me up, because it's the rules and bylaws. If we just let it go and we let other people do it, then we're going to get whatever we're left with.
Right. And like you said, people are being suppressed. And, you know, I know in our legislature, I know what's going on in there. The only thing I haven't done is vote. I am watching the bills. I know all the harm reduction policies for opioid policy backwards and forwards in every committee. When you're in a committee room, that might be the only thing that you know as a legislator, which is great because that's the work you're doing. But as a citizen, you actually have the possibility of really knowing in a much more broad way and researching the specifics a lot more. However, something that happens is that we can't, right? I've been able to sit in committee rooms on my computer doing my work for the dance festival for years and still participate that way. I've made it work. However, it's really not a feasible plan for most people. And so we then, as elected officials, you know, my plan as an elected official will be to ensure that those voices have a way to be at the table. Let's ensure that we create a situation, that we foster a democracy that actually seeks to lift people up.
Before the negotiations for the superdealer reform had started, the conversation was all about something you just talked about. And that conversation was, we need people to show up and we need them to be inspired. And the only way that happens is if they feel like they're part of the process. If people don't feel like they're part of the process, then they don't show up and we lose in the general election, because Democrats win the primary no matter what. So we have to get things, and this is really true of what you're saying, is getting people excited and part of the process and creating change. And that only happens by making them feel like their voice is heard. So it's really exciting to hear. And this is what I kind of hope to hear from all of our progressive candidates who, and I think the movement extends far beyond the candidates you support and all sorts of stuff going on with that. I think what really matters is if you're here for the people or if you're here for the corporations. And I see with you, a candidate that's really here for the people. You want to give the voice back to the public that has been missing. And that's why Republicans are probably winning in your state.
Right.
So,
I mean, I think that is part of it. I also think that we still have a belief that we need to lean center to grab the people on the right. And I understand that. I always think about negotiating. Like, you're no longer negotiating if you're no longer compromising if you've given everything and the other side has just continued to move away from you, right? And I think that we see that a lot in compromise and negotiation. And I think that it's something that has to shift and change. But it also is, again, you know, our legislators need to hear from their constituents. So that people need to know that just sending a simple email will work, that making a phone call will work, and then that their voice does matter.
And so what you're talking about here too, and I think we'll go back to, I'm going to bring up superdelegates for a different reason. I'm going to bring us national, because we're in a national audience. That's the only reason I'm doing this, I promise. Is that when the superdelegates, we were trying to convince the superdelegates in 2016, people came at it with a lot of vitriol, a lot of anger, a lot of threatening. Even right now, people are in this threatening, angry position. But I've found that if you actually just have a reasonable conversation with them, they're much more open to hearing what you have to say, because there are so few people being reasonable that it sort of comes like it's almost refreshing that someone's just treating them like a normal person for a minute.
Right. So there were these farmers that I talked to during my governor race. There's a lot of farmers in Vermont. So there were these farmers that I talked to at a farmer's market in Rutland. And they brought up property taxes, because property taxes are expensive in certain parts of our state. And it is how we pay for education right now. And one of the things I said to them is, what would happen if we moved from a property tax for the residential portion of your property tax to an income tax? And so our education system would be split across the board, right? How would you feel about that? And they said, oh, well, that would solve a lot of my problem. And then they continued to talk about the barrier and how this person had inherited land and was worried about their farm and so on. And I just had a normal conversation with them. They were Republicans. They had told me that. And as I was walking away, they said, Ms. Siegel. And I said, yes. And they said, thank you for listening to me. Nobody on either side ever does. And so it didn't matter that we disagreed in the end about some of it. we did find some places where we did agree. What mattered is that everybody needs to feel heard. You know, I was alone with a baby at the age of 25, and I did not think, after I had interned in Bernie Sanders' office, after I had done that work, and I did not think that my voice mattered. And we can see how our democracy breaks quickly when even people like me, who are engaged, who have voted every single time, who do believe in the process, see the broken system and feel that they don't have a place in it. And it's time for us to show them they do.
That's what's got to change. And I think the change starts with candidates like you. I hope that people are going to get behind your candidacy. I think that the establishment is already, having been somewhat involved with your process thus far, I think that we can definitely see the normal people who would line up for this seat not lining up. I think that people are recognizing what you're doing, and the real difference is if you can get the money from the people to support your campaign. And I'm hoping right now, I mean, I'm endorsing you fully. I think you're, this is going to sound weird at first, but I think you're our seat to win for the progressive movement in 2020. I think it's actually you and maybe Joshua Collins, who I'm hoping to have on the show later on over in Washington. I think that you're, I called AOC as a winner well before she won, before anyone knew her name. And it was because she had done an internship in somebody's office and was well in tune with other economic and how it works into specific niche things. And I think that you're demonstrating the things that we need to see out of a candidate in order for them to have the movement back them and really push them forward. So I hope they do. And I'm going to do everything I can to make that work. So I think we've covered everything. I think you're amazing. I put a post up about saying how amazing you are. And I think you've really proved that tonight. I want to thank you so much for being here. We are going to put, my pleasure. We're going to put some links up on all the posts we share of this. We're going to have both the links to her Democracy for America endorsement page. We're going to have links to her fundraising website. And we're going to do follow-ups with you because your election is actually very late. It's all the way in August, isn't it?
August 11th.
Oh,
yep.
So that's like
August 11th. However, I don't want people to think it's not time to pay attention right now.
Oh, it is time now.
Because
we need to get
right
on
now, I can tell you the access to money, I have the name recognition. Now I have the time, but I still have trouble with access to money. And I need people to donate. I need them to donate. And because here's the thing, we need movement builders in these seats. We need people that have spent their lives on the ground building movements, because those are the people that can bring the people, right? And
there are some things you can't teach. You have to learn them. And that's the thing. You've learned them. And I think you're showing to us and everyone that you have learned them.
Right.
So, yeah, let's get this woman some money and let's get this campaign funded and let's take the lieutenant governor seat. And I think that with her bump, the Democrat could win the governorship with her support. I think it really comes down to not that she will win because of them, but they will win because of you. So
that's very nice of you to say. I think we'll win because of each other.
Oh, well, that's the proper answer, as always. So that's going to be it for us tonight at Progressive Insider. We have a lot of interviews coming up. We also have a volunteer sign-up page. We're looking for artists, creatives, all kinds of things. If you're interested at all in volunteering, anything at all, and I mean anything. Did I wink with the right eye? Anyways, don't do that, she says. Anything at all, we will be happy to have you on board, and we look forward to your involvement. So until then, I'm John Ford, and thank you for joining me.